Hey guys, so today we're going to look at the history of where cells and their parts came from, we think. Remember that this stuff is highly theoretical, what we're about to talk about, and that's because planet Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and a lot of the stuff that we're talking about occurred in that first billion years that the planet existed. Therefore, there's not a lot of directly observable evidence of what happened, just because nobody was around 4.5 billion years ago to see all of this stuff. But I'll give you kind of the rundown and what scientists think in theory, and that'll give you some idea of possibly where cells and their organelles came from. So the first thing that you have to remember is that scientists do think that the first organisms on planet Earth were single-celled and prokaryotic. That leads us to the question then of how do you get from that to eukaryotic cells that have all these internal structures, all these organelles. And the Endosymbiant Theory attempts to explain that. Remember that if you break down the word endosymbiosis, endo means inside, symbiosis means two organisms living together. And you'll notice I've put a picture here of endosymbiosis, just kind of a really fast sketch. First of all, you have two cells, one large cell and one small cell. This large cell isn't really capable of getting its own energy, but this smaller cell can actually more efficiently get energy. And so probably what happened, scientists think, is this large cell started to swallow or engulf this smaller cell. So what you're seeing is the membrane of the cell kind of surrounding the smaller cell and encasing the smaller cell in a little tiny vesicle. That's what it's called when you get that pinching off. And then probably instead of digesting that smaller cell, the small cell inside was still capable of carrying out its life processes. So the larger cell was protecting the smaller cell, giving that smaller cell sugars, and the smaller cell was able to break those sugars down efficiently and produce energy for the larger cell. And so this became kind of a mutual relationship between them. That in and of itself is not enough to make an organelle though, okay? To make an organelle, and what's kind of hidden here behind this picture, is the moment where these two start to depend on one another and can't live apart, is the point where this little endosymbiont inside becomes an organelle within the larger cell. So the endosymbiont theory requires that a larger cell swallowed a smaller cell. That smaller cell started to benefit from the relationship, and so did the larger cell. And so they kept this relationship going rather than having the large cell feeding on the smaller cell. And then once they became so intertwined, so interrelated that they couldn't live without one another, the small cell stopped doing some of its life functions on its own and allowed the larger cell to do that for it. And therefore the small cell became an organelle within the larger cell. Now, that's all well and good, but it still doesn't explain where those first cells came from. That simply explains, or attempts to explain, how organelles came to be in existence. And really, remember, that only explains how the chloroplast and the mitochondria came to be in existence. And remember, there is some evidence behind that, right? You've got the DNA. Mitochondria and chloroplast have their own DNA. When the cell copies and divides, they divide themselves. The mitochondria and chloroplast self-replicate and they divide. The other thing is the mitochondria and chloroplasts are roughly the same size and shape as modern day bacteria, so they've retained some characteristics. Again, doesn't explain where the first cells came from. To go to that, you need to go to the Miller Urey experiment. What we think we know about the early Earth was that it was an inhospitable place. You had no free oxygen, right? You had a bunch of these toxic gases in the atmosphere. You had volcanic activity. You had all kinds of heat. You had violent thunderstorms with lightning, and all of that together. A Russian scientist named Oparin came up with his primordial soup hypothesis. And what he said was the early Earth's atmosphere had all of the atoms present. Even though they weren't arranged into biochemicals, the atoms that would make biochemicals were present in things like methane and ammonia and things like that. And he looked at the heat and electricity on the planet as activation energy that would be required to cause those molecules to react with one another and form biochemicals. Miller and Urey, Harold Miller and Stanley Urey, decided to test this primordial soup hypothesis. So this is the experiment right here that Miller and Urey did. Scientists believed that there was a mixture of these gases, so they kind of pumped these gases into this closed system that you're seeing. They put water into the system and heated it. So you're simulating, basically in this closed system, you're trying to simulate the Earth's early conditions. So they heated it up and allowed the gases to pass through a chamber where there were electrodes, and those electrodes formed a spark, which simulated the lightning. They passed that through a condensing tube and cooled it, heated it again, and let it continue to run through this closed systems. And this closed system lasted for a while, and after about a week, they drew off some of the liquid and they found amino acids in this liquid that they drew off. So amino acids were formed, and that's significant because remember, amino acids make proteins. Proteins are the molecules that can build other molecules. So if you can make proteins, you have a molecule now that's capable of catalyzing reactions to form carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids. That's a really important, significant step. So it's possible then that, remember from that hierarchy that we learned in Unit 1, that atoms make up molecules, molecules make up macromolecules, and these macromolecules are going to make up organelles within cells, right? So if we have the proteins from this primordial soup, those proteins can make the macromolecules that can make cells and organelles. Scientists have done some work to create little bubbles of fat in the lab called micelles, and you can actually get a self-sustaining chemical reaction to go on inside of those micelles. And that's just like a metabolism, right? If you think about it, your metabolism in your body is a self-sustaining set of chemical reactions. So scientists know that it is possible that if you had amino acids, these amino acids could form proteins. The proteins could assemble other larger molecules that could form bubbles and start creating self-sustaining reactions within them. The bottom line here is, no cell just poofed into existence, right? Cells had to come from a series of intermediate steps. There's a reason why it took about 1 billion years for life to form on the planet. You had to have certain changes to the planet that allowed it to be more hospitable, right? So you had to allow for things like cooling on the planet, oceans to form, things like that, right? And then once that started to happen, and you had these amino acids, then you could start building molecules that will make the cells and organelles. Once you've got that, you can start setting into motion a metabolism and start carrying out life processes inside of these little bubbles. And then of course the endosymbiont hypothesis, or theory, tells you kind of how those organelles could have came into existence. So again, it's not one big event that would have created cells. A series of steps had to happen, a series of very important changes had to happen in order to create the first cells on planet Earth.